I'm Erin. I am a second year in the econ department at MIT, and I am going to talk about adaptation to repeated climate shocks. This is some work from my second year paper. So with that in mind, I'm particularly receptive to any feedback or ideas you guys have. Well, in one sense, I've kind of done this through for the second year paper. In another sense, I'm hoping to relaunch it as a full project for the third year. So looking to improve on many margins and appreciate any thoughts on that. So as we've seen a lot of over the past couple of days, climate change has big negative effects on agriculture. And this comes from two sources. One is the changing averages, right? So average temperatures, and then the other one is extreme events. So extreme events being things like high temperatures, floods, droughts, and other things, cold shocks as well, other things of that nature. And so the extreme events associated with climate change are more frequent, more extreme, and more serially correlated. And so this means that from the perspective of a given household, they're more likely to experience multiple extreme events in successive years. And so I'm terming this repeat shocks. And so obviously there's, as we've also seen, a ton of literature looking at first, what are the effects of either a single weather shock, extreme event, or a longer run change for household welfare. There are a few exceptions that do look at these repeated events. And there's consensus that there are negative implications for a wide range of economic and health outcomes. And then a little less consensus, but a lot of work also testing for the existence or efficacy of specific channels of adaptation in ensuring against these negative outcomes. And so in this paper, what I'm going to look at is a household's portfolio of all the possible channels for adaptation. So pulling the main ones from the literature, which I'll talk about in a second, and how these interact. And then I'm going to take this to the framework of repeated shocks and see how does adaptation change from an initial extreme event, in this case floods, to when it's a repeated event. So when it's the second time a household is facing this. And so the setting that I'm looking at is flooding in Nigeria. So the motivation for Nigeria is that it is, its large population combined with its per capita very high intensity of extreme events and climate change implications that it's facing means that it hosts a large number of people who are going to be exposed to extreme events. And subsistence farmers, who are particularly vulnerable in any country, make up the majority of Nigeria's population. And then among these farmers, in the period that I look at, which is 2007 to 2016, floods are the most commonly cited weather shock. So 14% of households had at least one flood and 5% at least two. So as I mentioned, I'm going to look at different adaptation channels. And these are the four kind of key adaptation channels. If you're looking through the literature, you can kind of bin things into these. So we have, and these have all been kind of studied against, idiosyncratic shocks, but then also now there's increasing work on these forms of adaptation against single and kind of longer run climate shocks. So we have consumption smoothing and risk sharing. We have migratory responses, non-farm labor reallocation or sectoral reallocation, and direct kind of agricultural adaptation. And so I'm going to look at responses to flood shocks in these four channels and how these change when the shock is a repeat shock. And so the data that I use is the World Bank LSMS for Nigeria. And so what's amazing about this data is that you have both a very, very broad set of outcomes in terms of economic outcomes, but also agricultural activity and outcomes. And it is a panel, which is even better. And so households are visited 6 times, and there are 3 waves. They do a post-planting and a post-harvest, but the kind of crop cycles in Nigeria, there's honestly pretty continuous planting and harvesting happening throughout the year, depending on what crops people are planting in a dry season and a wet season. So it's a rough distinction. And so I turn this into a 6-wave panel and use the fact that at any visit, the prior growing season and thus the prior season's flood exposure is going to be different. We observed that 6 times. And there's low attrition, as we, including one thing that's really nice, especially in the setting where migration might be a response, is that they do a lot to track and survey households who internally migrate within Nigeria. And so while the measure I'm going to end up using, as I'll discuss in a minute, comes from the survey itself, which is something that I'm working on alternatives to. Other measures that I had explored had been external, and so with those, we don't see differential attrition with flood exposure. So a little bit more on the farmers and farming households in this panel. So these are, as I mentioned, subsistence farmers, right? So they have a few plots on average, and they're growing staple crops because they're eating about 60% of what they grow. But as is common in many rural settings in developing countries, most households here, just over 50%, own and operate some non-farm business. This is a quite poor sample on average. Food insecurity is high, and these households are not very well integrated into kind of formal financial systems. And so they rely on more informal, but the well-documented modes of coping, like risk sharing. And so the standard in the literature is, in the past, has been the Dartmouth Floods Observatory. As actually Jeff has shown in his work, this is pretty poorly measured within developing countries. And so when I take this measure and look at one thing that we have in the panel is self-reported floods, the correlation of the two is 0.04. So unfortunately, I can't use the DFO for this. And this is because they miss both a lot of kind of really small floods, and then the larger floods are poorly measured. So for most people, it's actually just a really positive income shock because it's capturing great rainfall. And so what I ended up using are the LSMS self-reported floods. And so they ask about flood incidents, both in the year of the survey and then in prior years. And so I string these together to get a sequence of flood shocks for household. And I'm going to define this in a binary way. Flood exposure is just whether the household reported experiencing a flood. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe you might get that, but I mean, there are many dimensions of this that won't matter, right? The floods came too late.
Yes.
If that's it, how far is the survey capturing kind of pertinent dimensions?
So that's the problem. So yeah, so they do actually ask about the severity of the floods. And so that is something that I am hoping to explore, like intensity, a more continuous measure in the future, because we do see a lot of non-linearities, right, in terms of how these things work. But so yeah, I only have the limitation of this is that I only have a yearly measure. And so most certainly that's incredibly noisy in that, if it's during a season where, floods are less bad, depending on the crop.
Is that, were there flood rains or did you suffer flood losses? One of those is capturing flood adaptation.
Yeah, I think it was, I should have the exact wording here, and sorry about that. I believe it was flood. Did you have a flood on your farmlands or something? And so, but I will double check on that. Obviously, this is a measure that needs work. Most of the floods do happen around August and September. So this is the main growing season, the wet season, and it's while things are in the ground being planted. So not that helps much, but with your concern, but so that's kind of what this is capturing. And so, but that's a
flood is sort of in the eye of the beholder.
yes, certainly. And so there's, I think, definitely concerns here in the way then of kind of like a recall bias, right? It's like maybe picking up particularly negative floods, especially if you're asking about past years. One of the nice things about this measure is that it's like slightly promising is that you do see that there's pretty high correlation between people in a given area and what floods they report. But certainly, I think I'm exploring two types of alternate data. So one would be some kind of satellite measure, and then the other would be I do have a lot of characteristics on elevation and soil type, and so combining that with rainfall measures, I may be able to directly construct a model of floods. But so for now, this is what I use, and this is what I am going to present for my results. And so this is, these are the instances of reported floods. So in blue, you'll see areas in which there were singular floods, and in red, you'll see areas in which there were repeated floods in this 2007 to 2016 time frame. And so the way that I kind of define these repeated floods, floods are the exact instantaneous flood measure is, as I mentioned, a binary for if a household had flood exposure in the preceding year. And then the prior flood measure is the 3 years before that. This is robust if you look at 2 versus 4, etc. And so I do include rainfall controls. They don't actually matter too much for the results that I do find, but this is just because, right, most floods, over 90% in this setting, are caused by heavy local rainfall. And so then, droughts are also a concern here, and so that is something that I do. And so the households that experience floods, single versus repeat floods, are pretty similar. This is just a selection of some of the household SES. These are the, you can see here, comparison of flood versus repeat flood households and their plot characteristics, but these are quite different from single or from no flood households. And so for now, I do include household fixed effects. But in the future, something I'm working on right now is incorporating shocks of other types, so that we can look dynamically without needing to kind of include household fixed effects. Okay, so diving into results here. So we see this is, validating the fact that floods have large negative effects on the share of crops that farmers are able to harvest, on the share of crops that they sell, on their food security. They're much less likely to have had adequate food over the preceding year, and more likely to need to borrow to pay debts, and have less likely to have spare money lying around.
I'm sorry, on the previous slide, there are, alongside the flood measure, there's also rainfall control. Is that what it says?
Yes, yeah, so as you're saying, this is because it doesn't matter too much. But the reason that I included this is because, when you're looking at floods, since they're caused by typically heavy local rainfall, droughts are on the other end of that. So right, you're not picking up, you're expressly not picking up drought affected households. So
Okay.
that's fine.
I don't know anything about this literature, so this might be a very stupid question, but is the distinction between a flood and heavy rainfall very clear for farmers? Like, is it clear what constitutes a flood and what doesn't?
Yeah, so I think that this, so a few things there. So the first would be that this is, again, self-reported. So you do have kind of like any, as Claire was saying, any kind of endogenous adaptation in being able to better handle heavy rainfall and have it not turn into a flood, right? That's definitely going to be captured here. So in this measure, that is definitely a concern, that distinction. But so a lot of what has been done in the kind of alternate satellite measures is specifically looking at that distinction, right? So how do you kind of map rainfall things into what is actually a flood? And so, yeah, that's like an active area of research that I guess Deb has done most of. And so, so we see that there's, in terms of this first channel of consumption smoothing, households are pretty likely to sell assets in response to flooding to kind of increase liquidity. We don't see formal borrowing and we don't see risk sharing. We also don't see any migratory response or any kind of intensive skilling up of receiving remittances from existing migrant workers abroad or in nearby cities. Households also do not seem to diversify into non-farm work, either on the intensive margin or on the extensive margin. And then there isn't a ton of data on, adaptation measures in this panel, but two modes of kind of better dealing with floods are having additional trees, as those help soil stability, and then monocropping is kind of does the opposite there. You have less root entanglement, so you're more susceptible to floods. And so we don't see anything on either margin here. So now turning to repeat flood shocks. So what we see is after a household has experienced a second flood, they sell a smaller share of their harvest, despite harvesting the same amount of the same share of crops on average. And these look the same if you do kind of the total quantities of crops as well. But share is a little easier to think about. And so food, and they're also more likely to sell assets. So they're keeping more food on hand and kind of more liquid assets on hand, or generating kind of liquidity. And so food insecurity and financial insecurity are no worse, but no better. And we don't see any additional risk sharing or formal borrowing. Households are even having faced repeated floods, no more likely to migrate. And so further evidence of kind of this constrained coping, right? So we see that they're keeping more food on hand and selling assets that they do have. These are things that require very little liquidity. In fact, they generate liquidity pretty quickly. So keeping with this, households are not intensively or extensively entering non-farm enterprises more, but they're less likely to close their existing non-farm enterprise. And so what this means is you see that these are typically seasonal businesses. So households generally will scale these down or shut these down when they're planting or harvesting. And so you see that households that have been affected by repeated floods, when the next harvest or the next planting comes around, are keeping that running, and that's what that's picking up. And so we also see that households are no more likely to take these kind of 2 measures of flood prevention following repeated shocks. So floods, as has been documented in a few other places, have large negative effects for food and financial security for households. And with we don't see much evidence of adaptation outside of this channel of selling assets. But households that do experience multiple flooding events are more likely to kind of respond where they can, right? So this is this kind of constrained coping. They're selling fewer crops, they're selling more assets, and they're not exiting their non-farm businesses. So this might be consistent with kind of this idea that they're, and as we see, they're incredibly liquidity constrained. And so they have kind of limited ways in which to cope, but they do kind of, after repeated floods, take these up. And this might be driven by the increased salience of kind of beliefs about what it is like to have recently gone without food, and the kind of magnitude of the utility loss that comes with a flood event. Yeah.
Sorry, one part, so I might have just missed it.
Oh.
You separate the salience, differential salience from differential impact. Is it just the case that if I'm hit again, my consumption takes more hits?
Yeah, so sorry, I did go a bit quick here. So food insecurity is no worse for people. So we're looking like kind of here. These outcomes.
None of this is controlling the magnitude, the relative magnitude of the first versus second.
No. But that's a good point. So no, food insecurity and financial insecurity measures are no better and no worse with repeat flooding. And the agricultural yields, one thing you would worry about is, or maybe it just damaged your lands, and we don't see that. Actually, the yield measures, the share of crops harvested, but also the volume of crops harvested, the intensive volume of crops harvested, is the same, regardless of whether or not you've had this kind of repeat flood. And so it does seem like it's not, and these are, it does seem like it's not coming from this channel of differential impact, but perhaps it is kind of a differential response.
Yeah, please. I was wondering, like, this, if there is no effect for the formal land, so are they also located in the basic same place? Because like the lenders, if they are also like in the same place, very close to the farmer, and then also exposed to the floods. So I was thinking, for example, like you said, there's around 20% of people, farmer, they have a bank discount. So it's on a more formal,
Yeah. So we don't see more formal borrowing, but so one of the things in general is, flooding and weather events like these are aggregate shocks, but we do see from the literature a lot of like Rob Townsend's work that these aggregate shocks are actually still work pretty well with risk sharing. So the reason for that is that households are farming different crops. So floods are kind of hyper local in that different elevations do kind of differentially protect you versus not from this, but also exactly the type of crop you're planting. They have different susceptibilities to floods, and planting timeline also matters a lot. So not only do different crops have different planting timelines, even within the same crop, you'll plant it at different times of the year. And so that actually offers, there's like still massive capacity for risk sharing within these villages. So I am a bit short of time. I have a second section about kind of how migration and actually risk sharing how they do and don't protect people from these floods, but I am standing between you all and lunch. So instead I will just conclude. So yeah, I think there's definitely mechanisms to test more clearly, but it does seem driven by the fact that households respond additionally to repeated floods, driven by kind of this increased salience of risk. And so and so lots of next steps in terms of improving the shock measure, right? Something self-reported is not great. And so incorporating other types of shocks, so then we can see, does it matter if the shock is of the same type or of different types? And then can look dynamically at like, what is the kind of recovery timeline? And how does, then looking at adaptation strategy, how does initial adaptation strategy affect subsequent resilience in addition to just static resilience? Yeah, so that is all for me. Thank you.